Please become a Patreon supporter to keep Pocket Bios commercial free and subscribe for more Pocket Bios. Richard Montgomery was born near Swords in north of County Dublin in Ireland. He was born into an Ulster Scots gentry family. His father, Thomas Montgomery, was a British Army officer and a Member of Parliament. Richard Montgomery spent most of his childhood at Abbeville House in Kensley in County Dublin, where he learned to hunt, ride, shoot, and fence. Richard learned to speak French and Latin. Richard Montgomery entered Trinity College, Dublin in 1754. Despite his great love of knowledge, Montgomery did not receive a degree. He was urged by his father and his oldest brother Alexander to join the military, which he did on September 21, 1756. His father purchased an ensign's commission for Montgomery, who joined the 17th Regiment of Foot. On February 3, 1757, the 17th Foot was ordered to march from its garrison to Galway, Ireland, and prepare to be deployed overseas. On May 5th, Montgomery and the 17th Foot sailed from Cork, Ireland to Halifax, Nova Scotia, British America, arriving in July. The British had planned an attempt on Louisbourg, New France, but the operation was called off, and they sailed instead for winter quarters in New York, province of New York, British America. In 1758, the 17th Foot was sent back to Halifax, Nova Scotia, British America, once again with the goal of taking Louisbourg, New France. The British commanders Geoffrey Amherst and James Abercrombie drew up a plan to assault the French at Louisbourg, which is located on the Atlantic coast of Cape Breton Island, north of Halifax. On June 8, 1758, the attack on the fort began. Montgomery landed on the beach under heavy fire and ordered his troops to advance with fixed bayonets. Montgomery's unit and the rest of the British force chased the French back to the point just outside the fort's guns. At this point, the British prepared to besiege the city. Montgomery had his men dig entrenchments and build breastworks. On July 26, following a series of actions resulted in the destruction of most of their fleet, the French surrendered. General Amherst was impressed with Montgomery's action during the siege and promoted him to lieutenant. In August, Lieutenant Montgomery and the 17th Foot sailed to Boston, province of Massachusetts, British America, then marched to join with Abercrombie's forces in Albany, province of New York, and then moved to Lake George, New York. On July 21st, the army began its movement toward Fort Carillon. By the 26th, they were in position outside the fort's walls, from which the French had already withdrawn most of their forces to Fort St. Frédéric. That night, after some exchange of cannon fire during the day, the French blew up Carillon's powder magazine and Fort St. Frédéric the next day, and withdrew to the far end of Lake Champlain. In August, the 17th Foot joined with the Lake Champlain Division and set out from Crown Point to participate in a three-pronged attack on Montreal, New France. The 17th Foot captured Fort Chambly before meeting with the two other divisions outside Montreal. Canada's French governor, seeing that the city could not be defended, surrendered the city without a fight. With the fall of Montreal, all of Canada fell into British hands. In the summer of 1761, Montgomery and the 17th Foot marched from Montreal to Staten Island. In November 1761, Montgomery and the 17th Foot set sail for Barbados. On January 5, 1762, the force left Barbados and headed towards the French islands of Martinique, arriving there in mid-January. The main offensive began on January 24th. French outer defenses were overrun and the survivors fled to the capital. The British prepared to launch an assault on the fort, but the French, seeing the situation was hopeless, surrendered. On February 12th, the entire island surrendered. After the fall of Martinique, the rest of the French West Indies, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent, fell to the British without a fight. On May 6, 1762, in reward for his actions in Martinique, Lieutenant Colonel John Campbell promoted Montgomery to captain and gave him command of one of the 10 companies of the 17th Foot. Spain entered the war in 1761 as an ally of France. The British High Command believed that capturing Havana, Cuba, would destroy the lines of communication from Spain to its colonial empire. The 17th Foot, including Montgomery's company, was to capture Morro Fort. British battleships bombarded the fort, silencing all but 2 Spanish guns. On July 30th, Captain Montgomery and the 17th Foot stormed and captured the fort. In late August 1762, Captain Montgomery and the 17th Foot were sent to New York, British America, where they remained for the rest of the war. The conflict was ended by the signing of the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763. Angered by the French surrender and unhappy with British policies that affected them, an Ottawa chief, Pontiac, organized 18 Aboriginal tribes that attacked British military and civilian settlements beginning in April 1763. The tribes captured 8 British forts and forced the evacuation of 2 more. General Geoffrey Amherst ordered the 17th to Albany, New York, British America, in June 1763 to assist combating the outbreak of hostilities in what became known as Pontiac's War. The 17th was first assigned to garrison duty at Fort Stanwix, where Captain Montgomery remained until 1764. The British in 1764 organized 2 expeditions to combat the uprising. Captain Montgomery and the 17th were on one of these expeditions, commanded by John Bradstreet, that went to Fort Niagara in July, where they were stationed for 1 month. They then marched to Fort Detroit, which had been subject to a surprise attack earlier, arriving in August. For several weeks, Montgomery stayed at the fort, helping to improve its defenses and also gaining an understanding of how to interact with the Aboriginals. On October 3rd, Montgomery and several other officers met with Thomas King, an Oneida chief. 2 days later, Bradstreet released Captain Montgomery, who traveled first to Johnson Hall and then New York, where he delivered dispatches from Bradstreet to General Gage before departing for England. In Britain, Montgomery associated with Whig members of Parliament who generally supported the colonialists in their demands for more political freedom. While stationed in Britain, Montgomery spent much of his time discussing politics. He also became engaged. However, his fiancée proved to be untrue and the engagement was broken. After being passed over for promotion in 1771, likely because of his political affiliations, he sold his commission for about £1,500 and left the military in 1772. He then bought scientific instruments, surveying tools, and draftsman tools, and sailed for British America in July of that year. He had decided to never marry or take up arms again and become a gentleman farmer. He bought a farm at Kingsbridge, 13 miles north of New York City. While adjusting to his surroundings, Montgomery renewed his acquaintance with Janet Livingston, who he had met during Pontiac's War. After receiving permission from her father, he and Janet were married on July 24, 1773. Because Montgomery was now tied to the Livingston family, who supported the Patriot cause, he began to turn against the British government. He came to believe that the British government was being oppressive and acting like a tyrannical parent state. After the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army on June 15, 1775, with Montgomery Brigadier General on June 22nd. Brigadier General Montgomery was ranked second in command of all Brigadier Generals. General Washington assigned Brigadier General Montgomery as Deputy Commander under Major General Schuyler. A few days later, Schuyler received orders from the Continental Congress to invade Canada. The idea was that the army was to invade Quebec, where the Hudson River and northern lakes could supply the army. A force was quickly assembled at Fort Ticonderoga, and Schuyler left to take command of the army on July 4th. Montgomery stayed in Albany, New York, for several more weeks, making the final arrangements for the invasion. His wife followed him as far north as Saratoga, New York. Washington decided to expand the invasion, ordering Benedict Arnold to lead another invasion force that would invade Quebec from Maine. On September 6, Montgomery led a probing force to Fort St. John's, the key to the British defenses of Montreal. Believing that the fort could not be captured quickly, Schuyler recalled Montgomery's forces and fortified their camp at a place with such a French name that I don't know how to pronounce it. Schuyler's health declined, so Montgomery assumed command of the daily functions of the army. Montgomery called a council of war, in which it was agreed to make another attack on the fort. However, word spread that a British warship was advancing up the river, and half the New England troops fled out of fright. Montgomery, believing his force could no longer take the fort, retreated. In mid-October, James Livingston, a relative of Montgomery's wife Janet, suggested to Montgomery that he might have better success attacking Fort Chambly, which, about 10 miles downstream, was weaker than St. Jean. Montgomery approved of the idea and ordered 350 men to take Fort Chambly. After 2 days of bombardment, holes were driven into the fort's walls and the chimney had been knocked down. The British commander surrendered the fort, along with 6 tons of gunpowder and 83 men. Montgomery sent the colors of the 7th Royal Fusiliers, who had been defending the fort, to Major General Schuyler, the first standards of a British regiment captured in the war. The capture of Chambly improved morale in the ranks of Montgomery's army, so much that he went through his plan to establish a battery north of Fort St. Jean while the colonialists were constructing the battery. General Guy Carleton, commanding the British forces in Montreal, realized that the situation at Fort St. Jean was becoming desperate. He personally led a relief force at the end of October, but colonialist forces successfully prevented it from crossing the St. Lawrence River south of Montreal. On November 1st, the new batteries erected north of the fort were completed. The colonialists began to fire at the fort and continued to do so throughout the rest of the day. At sundown, Montgomery ordered the firing to stop and sent a prisoner captured at Fort Chambly inside with a letter asking for the garrison's surrender. On November 2nd, the British agreed to surrender with full military honors. Brigadier General Montgomery then turned the army toward Montreal, New France. When Montgomery and the main army reached the outskirts of the city, Montgomery sent a messenger in demanding the surrender of the city or they would suffer bombardment. While negotiations for the city's surrender took place, British General Guy Carleton fled down the St. Lawrence River in a small flotilla of ships. The city surrendered on November 13th, and Montgomery and his army marched into Montreal without a shot being fired. On December 2nd, Montgomery joined Major General Benedict Arnold's forces at Pointe aux Trembles, 18 miles upriver from Quebec City. On his arrival, Major General Arnold turned over command of his forces to Montgomery. On December 7th, Montgomery sent an ultimatum to British General Guy Carleton demanding the surrender of the city. Carleton burned the letter. Montgomery, wanting his message to reach the inhabitants of the city, then set the proclamation over the wall with bows and arrows. Unknown to Montgomery, he had been promoted to Major General on December 9th for his victories at St. John's and Montreal. After Montgomery was unable to convince General Carleton to surrender, he placed several mortars a few hundred yards outside the walls of the city. The shelling of the city began on December 9th, but after several days it had failed to make a serious impact on the walls, the garrison, or the civilian population. As the bombardment of the city proved to be unsuccessful, Montgomery then began to plan for an assault. Montgomery would attack the lower town from the south, and Arnold would attack the lower town from the north. After breaking through the wall, Montgomery and Arnold would meet up in the city and then attack and take the upper town, causing resistance to collapse. To increase their chance of surprise, Montgomery planned 2 fake attacks. While the fakes were conducted, artillery would fire into the city. On the night of December 30th, a snowstorm struck. Montgomery issued the order to attack, and the colonialists began to move toward the designated positions. At 4 a.m., Montgomery saw the rocket flares and began to move his men around the city towards the lower town. Although the rockets were to signal attack, they also alerted the British of the impending attack, and the city's defenders rushed to their posts. Montgomery personally led a march to the lower town. At 6 a.m., Montgomery's force reached a palisade at the edge of the lower town, which they had to saw through. After they saw through a second palisade, Montgomery led the advance party through the opening. Seeing a 2-story blockhouse down the street, Montgomery led the troops toward it, encouraging the men by drawing his sword and shouting, "Come on, my good soldiers, your general calls upon you to come on." When the colonialists were about 50 yards away, the British forces in the blockhouse opened fire with cannon, musket, and grapeshot. Major General Montgomery was killed with grapeshot through the head and both thighs. With the death of Montgomery, his attack fell apart. Without Montgomery's assistance, Arnold's attack, after initial success, also fell apart. Arnold was wounded in the leg, and a large number of his troops were captured. On January 1st, 1776, the British started collecting bodies of the deceased and soon found the body of a high-ranking officer of the Continental Army. After being brought to General Carleton, a prisoner confirmed that the body was that of Major General Richard Montgomery. Once Montgomery's death was announced, Benedict Arnold assumed command of the American colonial forces. As Montgomery was a well-respected man on both sides of the battlefield, General Carleton ordered that he be buried with dignity, but not with too much fanfare. At sunset on January 4th, 1776, Major General Montgomery's remains were put to rest. Major General Schuyler believed that without Montgomery, victory in Canada was not possible.